you didn't, so okay, you're ready.
So you often hear people introduced as people, somebody you don't need, doesn't need an introduction, but then they go ahead and do an introduction anyway. So that's what I'm going to do today. So Bill Maston is the principal of William Maston Architects. Has an office on Casper Street in Mountain View, a street that he helped design. He's been very active in both Mountain View and Los Altos, both as an architect and as a pro bono architect, done a whole lot of work for this city as a contribution to the city. I think he and I, maybe we met I was looking through some old papers in 2000 when we were talking about a plan to build what we call the Commons, which was the 1st through 3rd Street parking plaza, which would be a park. An idea that has resurfaced again. Bill is experienced in all the things we've talked about, in specific planning, in visioning, in parking. His list of accomplishments is, you can find it on his website. He's a graduate of Cal Poly in architecture. So today we've asked him to talk about visualization, the means by which the decision makers and the citizens can understand how some development would in fact really look. So it's my pleasure to welcome Bill Maston.
I hope I live up to that introduction. Also want to introduce A.L. from my office. He's on our staff as an architect, and he's really kind of our guru in graphics and so forth. And really the purpose of today is to kind of let you know that there are some alternatives that we believe are a lot more effective in allowing the public as well as planners and designers to understand what we will be getting when we make decisions downtown or anywhere in town regarding new projects. With that being said, some of the information I'm sharing now is actually a follow-up to a presentation I gave about 3 months ago. And based upon that, I'm kind of modifying it a little bit just so that I can include some answers to questions that were asked at that time. But generally speaking, from a traditional standpoint until recently, we've relied on actual two-dimensional solutions to design. And what I mean by that, and I have some examples here, is it's not that difficult to actually get a photograph of downtown and the Civic Center area. That's great to show some existing conditions, but what does that really mean in terms of what we have now and what we can have in the future? Well, next to me here is actually our downtown zoning designations. And what does that mean? As an architect, it actually takes a lot of training for us to go through and be able to interpret what all these color codes mean. And of course, from my point of view, it makes it even more difficult for someone in the general community to understand what it means. So for example, it says R110 single family. What does that mean? R3.5 multiple family. What does that mean? Basically what happens is not only does it tell us about the type of use we can have, but it also indirectly tells us how high a building can be or how massive a building can be. Well, from the public's point of view, we really don't get the opportunity most of the time to understand what that means in 3 dimensions, and in some cases until it's too late. So for example, the public's not normally involved to the extent that perhaps a design committee would be, or the planning commission or the council would be, in trying to understand what a building looks like when it's 3 stories tall or 4 stories tall, whether it's compatible with the neighborhood or whether it's not compatible with the neighborhood. So literally there were thousands of hours spent by different planners and architects in the city to come up with a existing zoning and plan for the downtown. And more recently, there's been a lot of questions asked about that. Well, realistically, this plan, though it may have been updated in the last 10 years, really reflects the 1950s. And the reason why I say that is that there were decisions made in the 1950s, and some of them were very forward-looking decisions. And one of them in particular was the creation of our common parking lots. Those allowed the downtown to survive as parking became more important. But a lot of time has passed, and so we now have to look at things a little bit differently, because downtowns are so complicated in terms of their economics and in terms of really what brings vitality to a downtown and what makes it successful. So with that being said, I just wanted to walk over here and talk a little bit about what they're calling the core design concept for the master plan of the Civic Center. Now, this also is in 2 dimensions, and thousands of hours of time went into developing this concept. But generally speaking, when someone goes to the town crier and looks at this rendering, and they go, I'm going to spend X number of dollars on a bond issue, what does that really mean? They don't know the thousands of hours of time that was spent developing the programs to understand what it means. So it actually is much more difficult to be persuasive with the community in terms of what they're getting in the future. So today's presentation is not only about what we're getting in 3D, but what we're getting in the 4th dimension. And what I just in the last week, someone said to me, Bill, you need to talk about the 4th dimension. And I thought to myself, what does that mean? I'm an architect, and that's pretty abstract. But what it means is that we have to, as a city, look forward into the future. And looking forward into the future and using the right tools, it makes it a lot easier for all of us to understand that. So I want to take an intermediate step before we get into what we're using now within our office to visualize different things. Now, I did a project in downtown Mountain View about 4 years ago, and they actually said, Bill, you need to provide a model of the downtown area that's being affected by this. Well, that was the existing site, and this was our proposed development as it got developed. It allowed the Planning Commission and the Design Committee, the council, and even the surrounding neighborhoods to understand the context of our project in the neighborhood. But it did not necessarily allow them to visualize what it would be like from the street. So we used, as Marcia said, we used a combination of software, and we used a combination of physical models to create that. Now I'm going to come back and talk about models a little bit more, because I can build a model here that may have taken 2 weeks to build and cut and fabricate. We can build in a matter of hours. So imagine with these new tools how easy it would be for us to look at alternatives. So with that being said, thanks to Google and some different softwares that we have available, our discussion today really is about applying these tools to the downtown and our community center, civic center area, and how we can better take advantage of that. So Google's been nice enough to provide us with this information. And it's an amazing public tool because we can use it as the basis for future design, as well as understanding more accurately what we have available now and what this in particular means and what it might mean in the future if we decide as a community to make changes. So with that being said, what we've done is we've actually overlaid, using SketchUp, the existing massing of different buildings in town. So if we can kind of go out a little bit and get a more of a global view of the downtown and the Civic Center, what we've done is basically just go through in a very simple way and actually input all of the buildings in 3D. Now this is basically Main Street, State Street, First and Main, and our existing Civic Center up in here. Now, we have the ability to add much more detail as individual projects are developed, or if we wanted to now, we could actually go through off of Google Earth. We could take the individual photographs of the buildings, and off of those photographs, we could input more information. So let's say, for example, that we have a new project that we'd like to do downtown. And this project happens to be on Main Street. So we're gonna first kind of just walk down Main Street a little bit. And we're gonna bring this down to our level, and we're gonna say, okay, if, assuming that we had a little bit more articulation in this, we would be able to actually look at our new building in context. So, Eyal, if you could just take one of the buildings here, when we find it. Let's just take one of the buildings here and maybe make it a 3-story building instead of a 1-story building. Okay, now let's now go back down to the street level and look at what this means as a 3-story building rather than a 1-story building. Now, that's that fast. We just did that. So in context of understanding what this means, with not too much effort, we can say, you know, this whole area right here is zoned for 3 stories and it's zoned for 45 feet. So why don't we go to that section of town and make all the buildings 3 stories tall, even though almost all of them are 2 stories tall right now. So it would be very easy to have the community understand what this means in terms of what our existing rules will allow us to do. Now, with that being said, we could then go to various buildings downtown for proposed new buildings, and we could actually take the applicant's drawings and insert them into a master base map that could be maintained by the city, for example. So that any time an architect came in and proposed a new project, we could actually insert that, and then we would be able to see the context of our new proposed buildings with what's existing and how it might look in the future. So we have some very simple ways that we can interact. Now, imagine this fall, I believe the city council is working on the idea of doing a master plan for the downtown that might hopefully connect the downtown and the civic center together. These tools are very valuable in not only designing this new downtown, but keeping the public informed about what it really means and what it might look like in the future. So we're now going to talk about a project that was actually done a few years ago in the past. This is the project at First and Main. And I had actually, with our staff, we put into the computer the First and Main project as it's approved now. I actually received a set of drawings from planning staff and just put the massing of the building in. Our concern was the massing of the building so close to the street was maybe not in keeping or in proportion with the fine-grained character of our historic downtown. And our design guidelines talk about maintaining the fine-grained character. The question was, does this massing actually have a relationship to the fine-grained character of our existing structures? That was left up for the public to decide. We then talked to the council and said, look, we have an alternative building massing that will provide you with the same square footage, the same amount of parking, and will create an alternative that many people thought was less massive and would open up more to the street and have more public areas. Ultimately, they decided to go with the original plan, but with very little effort, we were able to demonstrate that there were alternatives that allowed the developer to provide the same information, the same square footage of building, the same parking requirements, and better meet the desires of having more fine-grained elements in public spaces downtown. Now, with that being said, I'd like to talk about what's going on at the Civic Center. our existing facilities. So one of the things that the drawings over to your right don't really demonstrate very well is what does this master plan really mean in terms of visualizing the future of our Civic Center. So all we did was pop in our existing buildings, which you saw just a moment ago. We then overlaid the graphics for our new proposed master plan, and we then put back in the original buildings that are there. So we have the starting point. Well, so some of the things that have been discussed about the downtown and this connection or lack of connection between the Civic Center and downtown really have more to do with direct connections. They could be for pedestrians, they could be for cars. Whoops. I staged that actually.
Very nice done.
They could be for buildings as well. So we added in the building forms and shapes based upon the square footages provided in the program, and we just added some more buildings. So you can see that there's these clusters of buildings with lots of open space. Now, this actually still doesn't actually create a connection to the downtown. And all I'm doing in the next set of slides is just showing us different concepts that people have discussed, both at city level and internally with different groups in the downtown. So one of the alternatives that we looked at was actually closing off the end of Main Street, connecting State Street to our Civic Center, and at one time there was an active discussion of having a roundabout. So these connections actually start creating a very strong connection to our Civic Center. Now, there had been earlier comments made about the Los Altos Commons. What we're showing here is not that Los Altos Commons solution, but a more recent solution that talked about actually having a green belt that connected the Civic Center to downtown. And this area of between State and Main Street are the most inefficient use of parking spaces, and therefore might make more sense to have as a green belt rather than perhaps some other areas. Now, this is a great grand plan, and it's relatively easy for us to convey this to you today. You can see it in 3Ds, you can see these different relationships that could exist. We then took it a step farther and said, well, we have all this land over here. What does that really mean, and is it effectively being used? There are people who actually believe that things like the theater and things like the library might be better served in a different location. So let's see what happens if we start looking at some alternative locations. This right here was an idea brought up by someone for relocating the theater here. The benefit of the theater moving downtown would be people are eating, entertaining downtown after dinner. They just walk to the theater. They don't have to get back in their car to go across San Antonio. Shows you where my office is. In order to enjoy going to the theater. It also frees up some space, so that's an interesting thing to consider. What happens if, for example, we took the library and moved the library downtown? So we moved both of these to existing parking lots. We did that in part because it's city-owned property. And one of the things that is interesting, in working with different people over the last many years, they keep bringing up that one of the most valuable assets that Los Altos is overlooking are our parking lots. That in many ways, that real estate is more valuable than the Civic Center. And it has to do with its proximity downtown. So as a resource and opening up resources to the city from a financial standpoint, having some of these areas developed might make more sense than actually developing portions of our existing civic center. So that's going to be a discussion for the future, I'm sure, by many. But let's see what happens when we start using or freeing up some of this land. So, can you take those two actions? Now we've freed up a lot of land in our civic center for other uses, and it didn't cost us any money. So that's a kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind, is that by looking at alternatives and looking at the downtown and the civic center together, that we actually might create opportunities elsewhere in town. So what I wanted to talk about next was actually what's going on here. And recently, and meaning very recently to me, I started following what's going on with the schools, and whether or not Hillview was, being an old school, was an appropriate location for a new school. Well, there's some things here that are, I'm going to say, in the way for the moment. Meaning we now have the proposed swimming pool and activity center related to the swimming pool. And I'd like to talk about that in context to a project that actually the city of Mountain View undertook with the school district in Mountain View. Interesting enough, at Graham Junior High School in Mountain View, we have the opportunity to look at the success of a collaboration between Mountain View and the school district in Mountain View. I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but this is a state-of-the-art, brand new facility. It is a football soccer field. It has a college-grade track and field associated with it. The city of Mountain View actually built underneath this a cistern so that the city of Mountain View could last 100 days if water supply was depleted during an earthquake. So 100 days of water were built underneath this because the city of Mountain View didn't have a location to put it.
It's actually 8 million gallons.
8 million gallons.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to remember that.
Yes.
So here's a collaboration between the city of Mountain View and the school district that allowed these beautiful facilities to be built, and it freed up a lot of land and opportunity for both groups. So let's go look at some of our schools in Los Altos. I think just for sake of conversation, let's say that we went to Block Junior High School. Seems like there's a lot of space there. There could be some opportunity maybe for the swimming facility. Same thing could happen if we went to Egan. Again, there's a lot of potential space available for a facility there, for example. Now, bringing it back to the Civic Center, and let's say that we move our swimming pool to one of those other schools, like, by the way, we used to have at Covington School years ago. We then have all of a sudden freed up all of this space at our Civic Center. That's newfound space. That newfound space could be perhaps used for a school. And just because we had the opportunity here because the space exists. Regardless of whether these are viable solutions or whether you agree or disagree with the concepts, really what it lets us know is that there's a very easy way for us to be very interactive with our communities downtown. Now, if, for example, we did these things related to the school, it's really a way for us to find land that we didn't have before. It's also a very good way for us to communicate to the community what this means, and that comes back to that concept of the fourth dimension. It's very difficult for us as a community to look forward 50 years. It's the hardest thing for any community to do that, because most of us are only concerned about, well, gee, my kids are gonna be in school for the next 8 years, so I'm only thinking 8 years ahead because they're gonna go to college and then they'll be gone and I don't have to worry. We need that long-range planning. We need the 50-year plan, the 100-year plan, so that when we can look at these, our master plan needs to be flexible, right? It needs to be flexible, so that if things change in the future, we can change with it. For example, the existing Hillview really turned out to be flexible because it became our community center. So it's not as though, for example, you build this new school at the existing Hillview site, for example, that it couldn't be flexible for future use because our kids' population goes up and down as it has in the past. But in the real big picture, what we're looking for is graphical tools that will help explain these concepts to the community. So what I would hope to see when we undertake this as a community in the next 3 months or so regarding the downtown and the Civic Center, that we can not only talk about the Civic Center as one element, the downtown as an element, but all of it together simultaneously, and we believe that this is an effective way to do that. Now, I was talking about this model, this 3D model. I love looking at models. Matter of fact, I'm disappointed I don't get to make them anymore. And the reason why I'm disappointed, what AL did after he put this into the computer, all he did was press a button. And our 3D printer created a downtown. Okay? So that's how easy it is. So let's say we're at a public meeting and someone says, what about this option? What about that option? What about this option? We could come back to the next meeting and you saw how fast it was to add these options. We can have it in 3D. Let's say that a developer comes to you and says, I'm actually interested in this building right here. All we did was take a portion of that map and blow up that section, and that's just a portion of the downtown. So these 3D models are extremely effective, and in a public presentation standpoint, it's a lot faster and easier for us to not only see it in 2D, but in 3D. So I want to talk for a moment about the process that took place regarding our master plan, so that I'm not discounting all the incredible hours spent on that process. The majority of the process that was spent there was in what we would call programming, understanding the needs of what the community was. For example, understanding what the community wanted in terms of a swimming pool, the size of the swimming pool, the size of the associated facilities with it. The same thing with the community center, the size of an entertainment room or a reading room or so on regarding that. The majority of the time was actually spent doing that. And so none of that is lost or discounted, right? Because now we understand from a square footage standpoint what the community needs. It's what we do next that really makes the difference. So with these tools that we have available, it really does allow us to take the next step and allows us to visualize in 3D and visualize it in 3D very quickly. And of course then with that develop long-term goals and long-term plans for what we could be doing downtown. So with that, I'm open for questions, if there are any. Yes?
On the Main Street one, so just a thought that if you set it up so that if somebody wanted to build more square footage, they had to set their building back so there's more space. But then the thought I had, then it would look like somebody missing teeth. You know, you'd have one building back, but the older building would be forward. But you could visualize that if you did that there.
Yeah, so let's see what he can, AL will do that. He'll just take one of these buildings and actually pull a portion of that back. And that would allow it to get higher, perhaps. and it helps you articulate spaces. So, for example, you might say to someone, and I know this might sound scary, we'll let you go up 4 stories if you put your building back an extra 20 feet. And that would allow you to have outdoor dining and other things that would activate the street. So absolutely, and look how fast we just did it. Yes?
Bill, I think one of the beauties of this is that we always talk about having a pedestrian scale downtown, but then we look at maps that are aerial things, and we rarely are flying over the downtown. We're usually walking. And so you can see that in a pedestrian scale from a 5-foot height or something along those lines, it changes your perspective enormously. And I think one of the failures of past plans is they're always seen from the air.
I definitely agree with that, and you can see from what we did on this previous review that we did for First and Main, that as we add more detail, it gets more and more realistic. Yes, Kim?
Can you similarly show, say on that building you were just demonstrating on Main Street, if it went higher and one of the upper floors was back more so that from the street you didn't have the sense of the 3 floors, how that looks? Yeah, so if that were where it was before in terms of setback from the sidewalk, but yeah, exactly.
So it's that fast. And then, if you can all remember, for example, I don't know if everybody would remember this, but when we were rezoning a portion of downtown, which is now one of the reasons for the development on First Street, there was a discussion about the what-ifs of how high. And this very easily demonstrates it. And then as we add more trees and more things, then we get more information and it's more realistic. I want to point out, and I don't necessarily want to show those photographs, but would be happy to at another time. AL has the ability to literally make everything photorealistic. We have the software to do it. So it would have sky, it would literally look like a photograph. I have some photographs in my office that are not photographs. They are actually straight out of the computer, and I will test clients, and they think it's real, and it's not. It's the inside of a residence, and they're going, what rendering? Isn't that a photograph? So we definitely have the ability to do that, and these are just showing us renderings of individual buildings that we've had approved elsewhere. And by the way, it's very photorealistic if we take it the step past this. So these are just different concepts that we're given for different projects, and when we meet with staff, we're rotating through the buildings, we're basically getting everybody's input. And in downtown Mountain View, for example, there's an Old Town Association, and I met with them a number of times on various projects, and with their endorsement, we've had our approval. So generally speaking, very effective tools, but what I'm really trying to endorse is we have the opportunity to use these tools when we do our precise plan or specific plan or master plan for the downtown. Yes, ma'am.
So your tools are focused a lot on building out, but can they also be used, or are there visualization tools for looking at street width and traffic flow and sort of realizing that? Because that's sort of still on a single dimension. We're going.
We actually can. There's been a lot of studies done about what is the appropriate widths of a roadway, and the concept of stepping back a building to increase the width allows those buildings to go higher. All of that we can simulate if we want to take the time. As a matter of fact, we can assimilate the economics of what happens downtown. Because when we actually go to the and go from 1 story to 3 stories, we've added, let's say, 10,000, 20,000 square feet. What is that used for? If it's office space, it affects the vibrancy of downtown. one economic way. If it's residential, it also affects the vibrancy of downtown, both in a positive direction, but some maybe a little bit more than others. It also increases the tax base. It also increases the taxes available to the school district. So you can actually model what happens financially to your downtown when you allow buildings to go 3 stories, 4 stories, or 2 stories. So this can all be very interactive, and that's actually one of the things that I think would be important for us to look at when we're looking at our downtown master plan, is that what are the economic impacts of limiting something to 2 stories versus 3 stories versus 4 stories. And it's very surprising what happens. Because you know, people talk, for example, about the vibrancy in downtown Mountain View. I can actually tell you the day that it happened. Up until 2004, downtown Mountain View was just as quiet as downtown Los Altos. But when Fenwick and West moved 430 employees downtown, up until that day, everybody that walked past my window on Castro Street was walking from the railroad tracks towards City Hall. Within 3 weeks after Fenwick and West moved in and 430 employees showed up, all of a sudden the people were walking the other direction because they were all walking down to the restaurants. It was that fast. So understanding the relationship between the amount of you know, retail, the amount of office, and the amount of residential is really the part of that economic key to your success of the downtown. Yes?
On your connection to downtown and the Civic Center, that map, so I just had a quote, the thought I had, so everything has the street, which is right over here coming in. But if you remove this building and remove that street, you can move, I'm just wondering if it lines up so you could have actually a pedestrian bridge from the Civic Center over to downtown.
Absolutely, and I'm going to add one. I don't know if we can add it that fast, but yes, we this was just a concept. If we embrace the idea of the connecting the roads and maybe realigning the roads, I think that would go a long way.
But you wouldn't need the street over here if you don't have this building. The street's here because the building stayed here in the plan.
Yes, the only reason why I showed it there is it actually shows in the connection on the proposed master plan. But those things definitely would be up for grabs, so to speak. One area I haven't talked about today, and we don't really have time to talk about today, is just about private developer participation and having these things happen, so that you don't necessarily need to rely on bonds in order to have a successful downtown. And I know that's an issue with the city, but this public-private partnership concept of revitalizing your downtowns are becoming very big issues. And for example, not that I'm always using Mountain View as an example, but the city of Mountain View just did an RFP and have 4 selected developers who are going to build a new hotel in downtown Mountain View on 2 city parking lots, and they are providing up to 260 new parking spaces free of charge to the city in exchange for the equivalent of a 99-year lease to build their hotel. So the city of Mountain View is now getting 266 new parking spaces for free. Plus, they're getting the tax increments from the hotel tax. Plus, they're getting a lot of other benefits to the downtown, and the city's not paying for it. The private developer's paying for it. But that negotiation is an art form, as city managers know. But this is the trend that we're seeing in the industry, is more public-private partnerships. Yes?
Well, thank you for the introduction. I love a fanfare. That bridge that just so quickly created, couldn't that bridge, perhaps if it was over closer to the Los Altos Grill, be the library or the theater that bridges over San Antonio?
So,
talking about using existing real estate.
Right, Hillview is
And let's make the bridge much smaller, just for, maybe we could do it over, I'll move it right over here. And then, hey, let's do something else. Why don't we make it green from here to here? And the reason why is recently someone even brought up the idea of undergrounding parts of San Antonio as a way of freeing up land. So let's say that we took from here to here as a lowered section of San Antonio, since so many people are just trying to drive through town, not actually come to downtown.
So my original thought on this though is if you move the building that you build here to replace this closer, you could have the bridge starts from a second story of the building, comes across, so you don't have to have a ramp. It has an
Yes,
elevator.
all of that would be possible, but why don't we take the green down to here? So let's pretend for a moment that we submerged a part of San Antonio. Now we just freed up all of this land that could be developed by the city. Half of it could be park. We could actually, every time we do something like this, we're freeing up real estate, the most valuable thing that Los Altos has. And guess what? I wouldn't be surprised if we could get federal funding for this, because the impact of all of this traffic isn't local traffic. It's coming from Highway 101 trying to get over to 280. So then we could put a building here. So the point is look how fast it is for us to come up with these concepts. And there's direct participation. It's amazing. And how about if we make it this long? So it's very effective set of tools. So now we have a bridge connecting across, we have an underground San Antonio, we have new parklands and new land freed up, all in the course of a couple minutes. Anyway, with that, thank you very much.